Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jennifer Lezak, Coordinator of Special Projects with the Adult Services Department, and on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Tonight's program is part of the 2020 One Book, One Chicago season, exploring the theme Beyond Borders and the book Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. For more information on other virtual programs, including book discussions, author events, workshops, and more, visit onebookonechicago.org. Thanks to the Chicago Public Library Foundation, Bank of America, Union Pacific, and United Airlines for their support in making this season of One Book, One Chicago possible. This program is co-sponsored by our partners at Northeastern Illinois University. Our thanks to NEIU for continuing this partnership, especially in these challenging times. And special thanks to Christopher Schroeder for all of his work in making this partnership successful. Thanks also to librarian Young Park at Albany Park Branch for her role in this partnership. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Northeastern Illinois University's Tim Libretti, Maria Della Torre, and Brad Greenburg, as well as Alana Murphy from The Beautiful Crossing, a platform for sharing stories from former refugees and asylum seekers. The panelists will discuss immigration and refugee challenges based on their research areas and experiences. We will also talk about the writing style and tone of Exit West, which is both sharply current and dreamily magical. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring the chat for questions from the audience for our Q&A following the conversation, so please feel free to ask one. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome our moderator for tonight's conversation, Tim Libretti. Tim is the Acting Associate Dean of the English Department at Northeastern Illinois University, and we're so pleased he's here to lead our discussion tonight. Please join me in welcoming our guests to the CPL virtual stage.
Thank you, Jennifer. And let me also just thank you, Jennifer, for also helping us cultivate this really great partnership between Chicago Public Libraries and Northeastern. And it's great to work with Albany Park Library and Young Park, our neighborhood library, and our neighborhood librarian. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce some of my colleagues at Northeastern before Alana Murphy introduces herself. So our first speaker from Northeastern tonight after Alana will be Professor Maria Della Torre, who's been at Northeastern since 2009. She's an associate professor and also chair of the Justice Studies Department and a member of the Latino and Latin American Studies program at Northeastern. Born in Mexico and completed her PhD in sociology at the University of Oregon. Her research centers on immigration and race and examines the ways in which the social constructs of race and ethnicity shape the lives of Latino immigrants in the Midwest. And she has paired her research and teaching endeavors with commitment to social justice movements in Chicago. She participates in a Latino community organization in the Near West Side of Chicago, where she helped to launch an oral history project collecting the stories of activism of a group of community members. And she is also a member of the Alliance for Immigrant Rights and Movimiento Mexicano. Our second speaker from Northeastern is going to be Professor Bradley Greenburg, who teaches in the English department. And he specializes in Shakespeare as well as film and creative writing. His publications range quite widely from articles on Shakespeare to T.S. Eliot. He has written Pushcart-nominated short stories and poems, and he also published an amazing novel in 2014 called When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed. And I also will be speaking again. I'm Tim. I'm a professor in the English department as well as acting associate dean in the College of Arts and Sciences. And now I will turn it over to our new good friend and colleague, Alana Murphy.
Thanks, Tim. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited to be here tonight with Professor De La Torre and Professor Greenburg. I want to briefly introduce myself. My name is Alana Murphy. I am the project founder of The Beautiful Crossing, and I'm also a Chicago native. I was born and raised in Oak Park on the west side of the city, and I went to Oak Park River Forest Public High School. My life took an unexpected turn of events after graduating high school. Instead of going directly to college, I found myself studying Arabic for a year in Amman, Jordan. During that experience, I had the opportunity to volunteer with a number of local churches helping Iraqi refugees. This experience inspired me to find out more about the refugee admissions program and about international migration in general. Since then, I've spent the past 10 years of my life researching and studying international migration, as well as working with displaced and refugee populations around the world. I have had the opportunity to work with a number of prominent organizations involved in international development and refugee resettlement. I worked with the UN Migration Agency and interned with the US Department of State. I care deeply about the US Refugee Admissions Program, and that is why in 2018 I decided to bike across the country to raise awareness about the program. Since President Trump took office in 2017, the program had suffered severe cutbacks, and so I decided to bike from New York City to Portland, over 4,300 miles, stopping in 15 cities along the way to speak with former refugees about their experiences starting over life in the United States. Their stories have been captured as part of the Beautiful Crossing Story Archive, which is available online in the form of audio and also portrait photography. Once again, I'm really excited to be here and excited for the discussion. I think each of us is going to start by sharing a little bit about our impressions about the book, Exit West. And there's a lot to talk about, so I just want to highlight one sort of factor or facet of the novel that really captured my interest. And it's the introduction of the idea of the doors, which is sort of the first magical or mystical element in the novel. And I believe that the author, Mohsin Hamid, has sort of a similar objective in using the doors that I do in my project. Typically, media, when talking about refugees or the migrant experience, tends to focus almost wholly on the migration experience itself, becomes almost obsessed with the idea of how people cross the desert or what it was like to smuggle away in a tiny vessel. And I think often this preoccupation actually takes away space from the migrants' experiences themselves, sort of reduces them just to that journey. And I really enjoyed that by introducing this magical element of the doors, and for those of you who haven't read the novel, our main characters, Saeed and Nadia, step from one door, through a door from one world to another. And in actually just reducing the decision to migrate to this experience of stepping through a door, it opens up space in the novel to focus more on their relationship and also the pain and disappointment that comes with migration. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Maria to share her impressions on the novel.
Hi, thank you. Good evening to everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I wanted to stress, yes, the doors are very important. It's a key element of the book and the narrative. But as I was thinking about the doors when I was reading the book, it created an impression on me of how the doors exist in the book because there are borders. Borders that are physical but also cultural and also emotional and individual borders that the characters have to cross, have to somehow overcome. So the first border that we encounter as we meet the two characters, Saeed and Nadia, is the border that to me was a gender border in a country that could be Syria, a Muslim country, majority Muslim country, where there are a lot of constraints on women. And so the fact that Nadia decides to wear the black robe to cover her body, and that to Western eyes may be interpreted as a form of oppression of women. In fact, for Nadia, it's a piece of clothing that gives her agency. So the border that is gender in a country like this, it's one border that we see in the book. Another border that I could see in the book was, of course, the physical borders between the countries, the nation states. That they, when the doors appear, they go through those doors so that they can escape the borders of each country. And then an additional border that I could see in the narrative was the cultural borders, the borders that define belonging once they go into different places. In Greece, in the island in Greece, because they are refugees and they are constrained to living in the refugee camp. Then they go to London and they are constrained again. They're not in a refugee camp. They're in the city of London in a house they occupy. And then lastly, the borders that they try to negotiate when they are in California, the United States, that have to do with religion, but also with culture. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I just want to make two quick points to start. One about form and one about content. The first point about content, I admire very much the way Hamid forges a link between hope and grief. Maybe two ideas we sometimes keep separate, but I think the book explores really beautifully this idea that migration involves a leap of faith and the prospect of hope, but it also means incurring a certain debt and a certain amount of grief in leaving loved ones and perhaps having a life that someone else can't have. And some of the most poignant vignettes in the book between the main characters, or involving the main characters, Nadia and Saeed, are explore these ideas, as well as the short scenes involving characters that we don't know, that just crop up in the book out of nowhere. And maybe we'll discuss those as we go forward. But there are several extremely beautiful, almost like short stories inside the book that are that just have stuck with me since the first time I read and taught this book a few years ago. In terms of form, I think it's worth calling attention to Hamid's sentences. His sentences are long and just beautifully wrought. And if I could use a professorial word, they're paraphrastic, they're roundabout, and they wander, and they do the kind of thing that the book is also trying to do. And so the form of the book mirrors its content. We have characters wandering around, making decisions they're not sure of, taking steps forward and then taking steps back. The main characters go out and they return. And Hamid's sentences do this as well. And there are entire paragraph-long sentences that wind back on themselves and go forward and back and forward and back. And you almost maybe sort of don't notice this in a first reading, but in rereading the novel, these sentences are just lovely places to spend time. And so I think the book's formal aspects are also a playing out of its content in an unusual and wonderful way. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Brad, and thank you all. So I'm going to follow up on some of Dr. Greenberg's comment. I just found this a stunningly beautiful and timely novel, and I want to pick up on this idea of hope that Professor Greenberg brought up. I think this novel teaches us how to hope and imagine change in very concrete ways, and hope often isn't that concrete, but here I really think it is in the way he narrates it. This is a novel that teaches us how to transition, right? That teaches us how to change. To get back to there's always an open door for Hamid. And, obviously the novel describes a world in upheaval, a world falling apart, a world with a lot of hardship and suffering and cruelty and threat. And yet, Hamid also represents this upheaval as a wonderful opportunity to transform ourselves and recreate the world in which we're living. And it is precisely because the world is falling apart, because categories are shifting, borders are moving, that we have this opportunity to rethink and to think anew. This novel is very much, I would say, about letting go of the familiar. We see this in the personal relationship with Saeed and Hamid. Saeed and Nadia, right? They let go of each other at the end. They have to move on, and that's not a terrible thing. That's a growth. That's we cling to the familiar sometimes out of fear, and as Brad said, right, this is about at times taking a leap. But I just want to look at a few moments quickly where we kind of see this. So there's a moment when they're in London and they're sharing this mansion with a lot of refugees. And Naji and Saeed are thinking about, like, what will we do next? Where will we go? And they start to imagine, like, what if all these mansions were built into different little apartments and we could all actually just live here? And that's just a way of sort of living in a space and rethinking how it could be organized so that we could inhabit it in a more humane way. And this elaborated later in London after the nativist aggression dies down and the country's trying to figure out sort of how to accommodate these refugees. Is Hamid narrates these moments where all the refugees, along with some of the local population, are working to build homes, and they build credit towards their next home, right? If they can do this. And this is real concrete kind of thinking about how do we organize our world, how to create housing for people, how to create a world that serves our needs and transforms in response to change and need. How do we evolve? How do we think about taking care of ourselves? And we see this also at a moment when they're living in London and the mansion in which they're living is constantly changing populations. And at one point it becomes dominant, what seems like Nigerian. And for Naja, she starts to attend these councils where she interacts with these people. And she also starts to see that they're not all Nigerian. And even among all the Nigerians, there are different languages, there are different cultures, there are different people, that these categories don't fit. These hard categories we've created don't really help us comprehend our world, that they need to shift and change. The world is more complex. Saeed, on the other hand, finds in another home in London a community with which he's more familiar from his native country. And he's drawn to this because it's comfortable, it's less dangerous, it's less threatening to him. And he wants to, and Nadia says, why would we want to go there, right? And she starts to realize my old country, as Professor De La Torre was talking about, was pretty oppressive for me, right? I don't want the familiar. I want something new and changing. And so, as Professor Greenburg talked about this mix of hope and grief and these things, this combination, I think is really one of the wonderful things that kind of Hamid gets at in this novel, that change and transition is painful, particularly in a war-torn world where there's division and hate and threat. But there's also this opportunity to really rethink what we're doing and create something new. So I'm going to stop there. So thank you all for your comments. So before we open it up for questions from the public, from our audience, we'll have a little chance for discussion among our panelists. And first, I have some questions, but I'll just ask if any of the panelists wants to say anything more or respond to anything that you heard or talk about another scene in the novel. No? Okay. So
a little bit.
Sure.
Tim, I really appreciate your thoughts on London housing complex, sort of this idea of how do we move forward, right? What are solutions? And I'm sure we'll get to talk about it kind of later in the discussion, but it's really interesting that the characters are not satisfied, right, with this housing complex that they're contributing to and eventually earning their own home in, and that both of the characters, even though now they've escaped sort of the oppression and the conflict of their home country, right, which remains unnamed throughout the novel, and they now have escaped the mansion, so they now have sort of a legal right to stay. Their movement is still restricted, right? They're actually still confined to this new complex in which they're building these homes. And I think that it's a key aspect in that propels them to then decide to step through another door, right? Try something new. And in some ways, I find that a lot of the migrant populations that I'm working with, right, they really are looking for similar things that any of us would be. They're looking for an opportunity to grow and to develop and to self-actualize. And so they're not happy, stuck in the complex that they're going to earn a stable home in, right? They kind of long for this freedom, and that's how our characters end up outside of San Francisco. So it is really interesting thinking about what is a solution and to what degree does it solve our problems, right?
I also wanted to add another observation that following on what I noticed as a migration scholar, that there are borders that the characters and people, real people, actually have to cross, have to negotiate. I wanted to know that when migrants, especially refugees, but also the undocumented migrants all over the world, when they cross a border, they're successful in that way, for instance, the physical border. But once they cross the border, their struggle or their problems are not solved. So quite often for both refugees and the undocumented, they end up living in spaces that are like limbo spaces, spaces in between, not fully members of the new society, not fully accepted or welcomed. And so they spend years and years, often their whole lives, in these limbo spaces. So an abandoned house, a refugee camp, a shanty town in the outskirts of another big city. And their lives in these limbo spaces are very precarious, right? So they don't have adequate housing, they don't have access to health services, education for them and their children, and the jobs that they hold are precarious. So I just wanted to highlight that aspect as well. Although, we see the agency of these characters, we also see the precariousness of their lives, of these lives in limbo.
Yeah, I think one of the really terrific aspects of the novel is the patience and care that it takes to build its two main characters as psychologically rounded people, if you will. We get a very deep look at them, and it's a novel about these two people and their struggles to overcome their own issues, how to forge a relationship between the two of them, to negotiate their religious beliefs, and so on, which is common to anyone anywhere in the world. And yet the novel simultaneously explores their efforts to do this in the face of all of the things that Tim was talking about, all the war and explosions and fighter plane, bombs and so on. And so I just really admire the subtle sort of psychological, like the baggage that the two main characters carry with them is multiplied by all of the things Maria was that you were just talking about, in terms of just struggling to do basic things: shelter, food, work, labor. The pleasure that they manage to eke out is a really interesting part of the book as well. Where's the leisure? Like the leisure and like things that we take for granted. That's what you got me thinking about. I've lived in 2 foreign countries, and I've lived in Canada and Norway, and those are pretty easy countries, easy situations to live in. I'm not comparing. Very easy, but it's instructive for anyone who's, if you've ever lived abroad, you taking things for granted suddenly isn't the thing that you take for granted. And so the way in which those are highlighted, sort of like in a micro way and in a macro way, right? In the small things and the big things, really comes out and just had me, as I reread the novel, just thinking through the simultaneous levels that Hamid beautifully constructs as he takes us through this book, which is not a book about plotting. It's not a plot-driven book. I feel like it's a book that we inhabit, and we go through things with the main characters. I guess that's true of all novels to a certain extent. But in this one, it's almost like a therapy, like a long, like a long session with them or something. I don't know. I'm having multiple thoughts about it in those directions. Sorry.
Okay. So maybe people want to talk about this, but Brad, you brought up the pop-up characters, or for lack of a better term, these characters that pop up in the novel and usually get a page or two. So I'm wondering, from each of your perspectives on sort of issues of migration, like how do you see these characters working in terms of elaborating what Hamid's saying overall about migration, or any other thematics that you see at work in the novel? And I have a follow-up question. Maybe I'll hang on to the follow-up question so I don't distract you. And is there one of these characters that you remember kind of most vividly and sort of helping you think about how that feature of the novel's working?
Sorry, but the two old men, the man who lives in Amsterdam, and I wanted to get in and say this before everybody. I'm afraid this was everybody's favorite, maybe. But that is such a lovely little piece. It's worth reading the whole novel just to read those 2 or 3 pages, despite everything else. And maybe I won't ruin it for people who haven't read the book, but there's a sort of reluctant old man. It's called The Old Man. It's not just me saying this. And they're not named. Often in the book, the names are withheld in ways that are very interesting. But the old man and the wrinkled old man, or something, I forget how it's called. But these 2 men are drawn together in a couple of pages, and it ends with a photographer taking a picture, an intimate photograph of them, and then erasing it, and it's just a beautiful set piece. I'm hesitating to like narrate it out for you because I want you to experience it if you haven't read the novel, but it's like it's just buried itself in my heart the first time I read it, and I couldn't wait when I reread the book to encounter it again. It's a beautiful, as a writer, I'm just tip of the cap to that piece of the book. Okay, I'll shut up.
I can jump in again. I really appreciate Brad bringing this up and Tim touching it on again. I think the first vignette that jumps away from our main characters is 2 Filipinas in Japan, I believe. And there's a man who walks out of a bar, and he watches these Filipino women walk down the street, and we sort of understand as the reader that he has some nefarious intentions towards these 2 women and follows after them. And then it's never touched on again in the novel, right? And so for me, reading that section, I was like, wait, what is this book? Wait a second. Is this going to skip around? Are there different characters, right? It's that moment where, as the reader, you realize that you really don't know where Hamid is taking this book, right? And it really forces you to reconsider what you're, as a reader, not only kind of the initial box that you put characters into, but the initial box that you put the book into. And I think for me, I spent time in the Philippines doing research on Filipino migration. And I became interested in that area because I had lived in the Middle East, where there are a lot of Filipinas working as domestic household workers and in other capacities in those countries. So for me, I was particularly intrigued that he included this, especially since it isn't the type of kind of migratory pattern that's making it to the news at this point, right? Or hasn't been kind of highlighted in 2016, 2017 with the migration crisis, right? So I really appreciated that in that moment, the author acknowledges that there is a diversity of experiences, but that also there's something similar amongst all these experiences, right? And I think in the novel, he does an amazing job of continuing to focus on both the micro and the macro, right? As Brad mentioned, the book is really not driven by plot, right? It's about these 2 characters and their relationship, so it's very micro in that sense. And we find all these details about their lives, their personal baggage, as you said. But then at the same time, somehow, Mohsin Hamid ingeniously always brings us back to the larger idea, this kind of greater push for greater acceptance of migration and freedom of movement within the novel.
Did you have anything, Maria?
Yes. One thing that also was interesting to me was that at the end, you see that both Nadia and Said kind of find communities each of where they work to belong. but also communities that exist there, created by the migrants there, that welcome them. And these are kind of informal communities at the margins. So for Nadia, is this community, multicultural community, and then a partner that she finds, you know. In Nadia, as you all pointed out, she's more willing to taste others, taste other cultures, and participate in the cultures of other groups, like the Nigerians in London, but also in California. So more adventurous, I guess you could say. And Said also finds a community for him that welcomes him, but also a partner at the end. That is more of a community, as somebody mentioned, you know, that is more familiar. It's familiar in terms of religious, his religious belonging, and a partner that kind of belongs to that religious community. So the idea that that these migrants, wherever they go, even though the circumstances are difficult, and sometimes they encounter xenophobia and difficult life conditions, there are still communities there that exist when they arrive, that welcome them, and that they strive to belong as well. So that was like when you were mentioning hope, for me that was hope. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So let me just indulge myself as a moderator for a second. But so I want to bring up another one of these brief character sketches he gives. And something, Alana, you said made me think of this character, and I can't quite remember what it was, when you're talking about the moment with the two Filipinas in Japan, that you said something like, you made some mention of what characters share, or some elements of experience that they share. I think maybe you said something like that. And Maria, you've been talking about this issue of the various ways that beyond just nation states, the various kinds of borders that exist for people in the novel. But I think the last character sketch, maybe it's not the last, I can't quite remember, but it's an aging woman who's lived in her home all her life and hasn't moved, but how everything that shifts around her has changed. And that this, in a sense, has made her, as Hamid describes it, as kind of a migrant. And I believe he ends that section saying that all of us are migrants. So I guess I wonder, I kind of want to know how you understand that. What would it mean for all of us to be migrants? And maybe this question too, sometimes I worry when we generalize like that and try and universalize that maybe we lose the specific and historical. Like, well, we're all just migrants, and that could diminish the if you see what I'm saying, the actual material experience of some of these changes. But so I just wondered kind of what you thought about that, and kind of the importance of that, kind of that moment, if you had any thoughts about it.
One thing that comes to my mind is the fact that the world we live in, it's a globalized world. We travel, people living in wealthy countries have the ability to travel more easily than others. But at the same time, because of the histories of colonialism and neocolonialism and global capitalism, what we see today is that the global south, what people call the global south, the more impoverished countries, are migrating north because they are looking for better economic opportunities, or because they are escaping war and conflicts. So in a way, the world is coming to the wealthy nations, whether we want it or not, because of this history. So the woman that you mentioned, Tim, living in, I think, in Sacramento, that's what she sees, how the world is changing around her, because many migrants are coming, many other things are changing. That's one thing. But also because of the history, because of the globalization that we are seeing, we know what is going on around the world. So I know what is happening in Tokyo if I just do a Google search, and I know what is happening on a street corner in Tokyo because of the webcams that they have. So we know about the world, about the others out there. So in a way, they're here. So these borders that we have are very malleable, very what is the word that I'm looking for here? They're porous.
Permeable.
Yeah.
I do think that a lot of the sort of magical nature of the novel is in some ways a stand-in for technology's impact, or the ways in which both our phones, right, social media, or the ways we're connected online, and also sort of rapid travel has allowed us to now connect in almost a magical way, right? And I do think that in some ways the author is playing with that idea, because in the book it's presented as this fantastical element, right? But in some ways it already exists, right? We already are living actually in the world of the novel. It's just we don't quite recognize it, right? And I think I do really appreciate with that character, the woman in Sacramento, there's also an older woman whose daughter migrates away. I don't remember what region she's in exactly, and everyone has migrated away. And her daughter asks her to come, right? And she refuses to go. And then there's several characters like Brad brought up who step actually from sort of this Western, more affluent world and migrate south. And I actually really appreciated that those sections were part of the book, right? And it kind of complicates what you think is the pattern, and what the pattern of migration will look like in the future, right? We don't really know.
Yeah, there's the man who goes to Namibia. He's about to kill himself and walks through a door into Namibia. Yeah.
There's a
Brad,
really great. Oh, I just want to share. Alana made me think of this great quote by the novelist William Gibson, who says, "The future is here. It's just unevenly distributed." I always think of that in this context, in part because I think you're right that the doors are a kind of like a technology, he never explains how they work. He never engages in any scientific explanation or anything. No physics. You don't have to do any math, to read the book. But that's also there's that period in early in the novel where the doors are jealously guarded and people are risking their lives and killing one another and so on over access to them and so on. And he definitely plays around with that idea of who gets to do these things, as Maria was saying, the way in which capitalism dictates who gets to have access to what opportunities and so on. It's very cleverly done in the novel, and makes it a pleasure to not have to sort of negotiate those things and to be able to go right back to the characters the minute that becomes, I think, burdensome, when you're reading. So that's all.
Yeah. It's about time to open it up to our audience, but I did want to just come back to the doors, since it's where we began with Alana began bringing us into the novel, and they surprised me, and I thought a lot about them. And sometimes I found myself kind of, it's like Frederick Douglass in his narrative won't narrate his escape, in part because he doesn't want to give it away, how he managed to escape to the north. And I don't think that's why Hamid's doing it, but I did find myself wondering, kind of, I don't know, almost wanting to know a little bit about the process, of how you do it, but nonetheless fascinated by the doors. And I wonder if Alana started out, so if Maria or Brad, you wanted to say anything more about the doors or had any sense on how he managed to not narrate the migration process. I thought it was a great observation to talk about what it allowed him to do instead, Alana, the space that he could give just to the experience and everything. But I don't know if anyone had any follow-up. If not, we can.
I was just really struck by at times going through the doors was sort of like a rebirth and a birthing process. And it was a restoration of a kind of livelihood. That's the wrong word. A kind of revivifying, and so because of refugee camps and the traumatic nature of so much migration and et cetera, huge subject, that struck me as being potentially maybe a little too easy. I don't know. Maybe Alana, you probably have thoughts about that. But going through the doors makes things seem pretty simple, and it's clearly maybe that's slightly the wrong focus, and we probably shouldn't depend too much on that. But I thought it did potentially simplify things.
I do think that in the novel it was portrayed as a very positive, not positive, I don't know exactly what the word is, but sort of like this kind of the character makes the decision, right, and then they step through the door, and it's almost like they forget where they came from, and they find themselves in this new space, and there's sort of this reckoning too of what's happened. And I do think that is there are a lot of people who the decision to get somewhere is just the first step of a very long process, right? And I do think that is kind of not belittling that experience, but I really do think that it was the author's choice to really open up room for dialogue and development between the characters, right? Kind of, and maybe it is because we are sort of, as in kind of the general public, fascinated with that process, that he kind of pushes us on, actually, kind of spurs us to think maybe about the next level, right? What it's like for people after they arrive.
I agree. The process for migrants or refugees, as you said, Alana, when they decide we're gonna leave, and after that decision, the process is so difficult. They need monetary resources. Both refugees and migrants who are living for economic reasons. It involves a lot of money. The poorest of the poor, even when they seek better jobs in a wealthy country, the poorest of the poor cannot leave because they don't have the resources. So the migrants that we end up receiving that come to looking for jobs, they actually have some resources, but because they have to pay their fare, say transportation, but also accommodations along the way, and quite often the services of smugglers. It's very, very expensive. Many of the refugees that left Syria, for instance, have to have some kind of monetary resources to reach Europe, because along the way they have to pay many, many, many smugglers to ensure their safe passage. So it's quite striking, because the doors in the novel don't talk about that grueling process. So that's interesting.
It is, and again, I thought it was a great observation. Say, what does it allow him to do? Because that would have taken a lot of time.
Yes.
So we'll open it up soon. I just want to make one comment. I think, Alana, you mentioned an older woman who I think in the novel is just called the maid.
Yeah.
One of these characters, and who doesn't leave. Her daughter has migrated and keeps coming back, saying, "Why don't you come with me, right, to my new land?" And she says, "Well, maybe one day." And this kind of mirrors also Saeed's dad, who doesn't want to leave either. And I found this, just for the human dimension of the novel, as an old man myself in a changing world, I often wonder about my ability to adapt or do something different. And, he's also getting I don't even know how to put it, but this thing with people are kind of at peace, saying, I know the world's changing and I'm good right here. And I don't really know what to say about it. I just found it a really kind of way in which, in a rounded way, he was getting at people's different responses to a changing world, and even kind of different capacity and resources to change at certain moments. I don't know. I'll leave that there. So anyway, I'm sure since such an exciting novel, I'm sure I can't see the audience. I don't think any of us can, but we know you're there, and I'm sure you're chomping at the bit to discuss this novel with the panelists. So I know, Jennifer, you're monitoring the chat, and I hope we didn't go on too long, but why don't we see
No,
what's
you're
going on out
fine.
there?
Yeah,
All
we
right.
got some great questions coming through. So first one, Alana, why did you start to meet and collect the stories of refugees through your project, The Beautiful Crossing? And what was the most powerful message that you took away from your project and Exit West, sort of commonly? How did you find they compared to each other?
Sure, I can appreciate getting to talk more about The Beautiful Crossing. I can talk a lot about it. I had the opportunity to work in refugee resettlement here in Chicago, actually with an organization called World Relief. And that meant that I was a caseworker, part of a team of people who's receiving refugee families right when they arrive in O'Hare, bringing them to their apartments that we've set up for them, helping them learn how to take the train, sign up for Medicaid, get health insurance, register their kids for school, every single step of what it takes to kind of restart your life here in Chicago. And I became very close to a lot of those families. I spent a lot of time with their kids, a lot of time cooking with them, eating with them. And essentially in 2017, actually earlier even in 2016, when the dialogue started to shift very dramatically regarding refugees, I was very surprised by people's reactions. And I realized that largely it was because many people did not have the opportunity to spend the time that I had with those families. And so I was really brainstorming and thinking of how can we kind of push people to step outside of what they're reading in the newspaper, what they're watching on the news. And I really believe that having that opportunity to meet someone on a personal level as your neighbor, or as, you know, sort of the parent of your child's friend in school, right? Or that person who owns the business right down the street from you, having that capacity can really help people to think differently. So all the stories that I gathered are actually, they're just about that. They're about former refugees' experiences here in the US. So rather than focused on their migration experience, it's really about, hey, what do you think about the United States? What do you hate? What do you love about the US? What was it like putting your kids in public school? What was it like the first time you ate McDonald's, right? And I really believe that these moments and sharing these moments and really giving a platform to former refugees to talk about what they want to talk to can be extremely powerful. So that's really why I decided to create that archive. And I, as I kind of opened up with my opening statements, I really appreciated that type of perspective in the novel. So trying to focus on the day-to-day, right? That nitty-gritty, like Maria and Brad were talking about. What is that experience like for people, right? And the resilience that these characters show and the multi-dimensionality. We didn't really talk about it that much in our discussion, but there's a whole beginning section of the book before the unnamed country of our two main characters goes into war, in which they're falling in love, right? And their love story is very humanized with these sort of social media aspects, right? Are the two of them smoking pot on a rooftop garden, right? And these kind of moments that then actually really, they make those characters so relatable, particularly to, I think, sort of my generation of younger kind of international youth, really. And I really appreciate that in the book. I just want to open it up to the rest of the panelists' thoughts on kind of the humanizing aspect of the novel.
That's great. Yeah. And I should mention too, I'll plug your website for you. It's beautifulcrossing.com, but we put it in the chat as well. And I would encourage people to go and look at some of those beautiful stories that you have there. It's really a remarkable collection. This is a really interesting question for the professors here. NEIU is known for having many students who are new arrivals and immigrants or children of immigrants. And can you talk a little bit about how teaching there in that community might be different than if you were a professor at other schools? Anybody from Tim, you want to start?
What's true that we get people from all over, and I for some reason, the minute you said that, I don't know why, but I went back a number of years to when we were getting a lot of students from Bosnia during the genocide, and you know, so it makes teaching at once all the more important, and in a certain sense all the less important, if that makes sense. Like I always say, some of the students we have at Northeastern, it's not just amazing to me they're in school, it's amazing to me that they're alive when I hear that experiences. So in some sense, we can try to often sort of exalt what we do, like it's so important what I'm teaching, but it gives a certain humility to what we're doing, to understand what our students have been through. So caretaking is not the word, but a sense of just there's a really kind of intense and profound meaning given to the sort of the work that we're doing, and knowing how serious it is for our students, if that makes sense. Like this is an incredibly serious pursuit, and maybe doubly serious than your ordinary student coming from a local high school, in the sense that so much depends on it, and so much is behind the change in these people's lives, as we see in these novels. I don't know. That's for lack of a better answer right now.
That's great. Maria or Brad, did either of you have any thoughts on sort of that experience of being a professor at a school in that community?
Yes, I did my PhD work at Oregon, at the University of Oregon in Eugene. And so when I was doing that, I was a teaching assistant for professors. So I would be grading papers from undergrads and so on. From that experience, when I compare it to teaching in Chicago at Northeastern, one thing, of course, I teach classes on migration, but so when I teach here at Northeastern, many of my students are first generation migrants, and so when we talk about topics on migration, they bring forward the experiences of their own families, their parents, or themselves as migrants, and also as the cultures or their cultural heritage. And if I compare these to the students I taught in Oregon, in Eugene, it was very different. At the time I was a grad student, the majority of the students that I had were white students, Anglo-European, and some Asian students or Asian Americans. So that wouldn't be highlighted. The topics, you read the materials and talk about the materials, but not personal experience, usually not. So that's one key, definitely. The migrant experience is part of the lives of our students. So that's one important thing, and it enriches the classes, my classes at least.
For me, as a first generation college student and from a deeply working class background, our students are so terrific because they're real people living real lives every single day. And so the culture at NEIU is, for me, so great because it's the culture of the city. I like to think that we're like a cross section or a biopsy or something of the city itself, and it's a brilliant place in which the politics that sometimes academics have to engage in outside their campus experience, because that can be a little bit of a monoculture. At NEIU, it's there all the time, every day. It's the water we swim in. It's not extrinsic to the place. And so I know what Tim was trying to say is that it's just incredibly rewarding that we get to participate in people's lives, and I hope make them better and allow people to gain skills that they really use and that make a difference for them.
What a great place to teach and to be a student, right? We have another question from Christopher. It says, I was tracking the negotiation between Nadia and Saeed throughout the story, which seems to location or place. How would you describe this negotiation and the role of place in the story?
Well, I'll just say quickly, it's a novel of developing characters, right? That's what novels do. They develop characters. But Hamid says a few times, right, that people change in context, right? And the world impacts them and they change and they evolve. And for me, that relationship, I thought the narration of their relationship was so amazing, and that it wasn't just a narration of their coupling, it was a narration of their decoupling. And I don't know how often you see that in novels as carefully and tenderly as he was able to narrate this, as they look out for each other and care for each other, but know they need to not be with each other. And again, for me, that was so neatly woven into this larger theme of the need for transitions in our life. I don't think we're really good at transitions. Little kids, like if you raise little kids, one of the things they have trouble with is transitions. But, I think we all do still. And our world does a really bad job of it. And he does it on the large level and then in this really intimate relationship in such a beautiful way. And I can't remember seeing a decoupling narrated in quite that way. That's not exactly what the question asked, but that's my answer.
It's great. Anyone else have thoughts on that? I think we have maybe one more question before we wrap up, but want to give anybody else a chance to respond to that. So let's ask. Oh, go ahead, Ellen.
I was just tying back to Tim, and then also something that Maria brought up at the beginning about the black robe, which, of course, from my experience in Jordan, I interpret to be an abaya. But I thought it was really interesting that one of the areas that they are negotiating or that there's conflict around is this idea of religion, right? And kind of how one should express one's religion. What does it mean if one does believe in one's religion, right? And that's kind of actually a core area that they're negotiating. And I do think it's really interesting as someone who has lived in a Middle Eastern country and in a very conservative part of that country. I do find that actually covering, or the way that I chose to dress, became a tool that I could use to empower myself. So I identified very, very quickly with Nadia in the novel, and very much felt like I understood her reason for wearing this black robe, right? And it's interesting that actually, even as Saeed becomes sort of more religious, he really can't, it actually kind of tears him apart or frustrates him more that she wears this symbol without having it mean what he thinks it should mean, right? So I think, yeah, and I really think, Tim, you're right, you hit it. There's a lot of developments, and I love how the author handles conflict in this very sort of healthy way, right? How many examples do we have, whether it's books or media or film, of sort of conflict being handled in a loving way between a couple? Not very often.
Yeah.
No, that's true. They're a great story, aren't they? Just really lovely, lovely writing. So I think we have time for just one more question, and this is to everybody. What do you think are the best ways for folks to support immigrants, refugees, and newcomers from your own perspectives? Alana, do you want to start off, sort of having worked in direct refugee resettlement?
Sure, I'll start off, but I do want to make sure the other panelists have time to talk, and I'd love to. I really enjoyed hearing the three of yours thoughts on being a professor for students from an immigrant and migrant background, so that was great to hear. I do think that our country is heading into sort of a new chapter in terms of migration and refugee resettlement particularly, so it does look like the refugee resettlement program will kind of acquire new wings under the sort of administration change that's coming up. And I think that will actually open a lot of opportunities for people to volunteer, to find out more about refugee resettlement, and to get engaged. So if you are in the Chicago area or in other cities across the United States and you're interested in finding out more, there are a number of refugee resettlement agencies, probably in a city close to you or your home city, that are working with migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, and they're always in need of volunteers. But I also think it's particularly important to, based on what's happened the last 4 years, to be vigilant and to be following sort of policy developments and what's going on in our country. And I'm sure that maybe Maria, from your experiences, you could talk more some of the changes that have happened in the last 4 years. And I think sometimes there's initial media attention, but often people are kind of not really interested in understanding more, maybe the more nitty-gritty aspects of those policies, and therefore kind of really aren't sure how to engage with them in a good way. So continuing to look for information to educate ourselves, and definitely please reach out to some of these organizations and be willing to volunteer. That's a great way to respond.
Yes, I just to follow a little bit up on what you have been saying, Alana. Indeed, yes, it seems we are going to have a better world for refugees and asylum seekers here in the United States, or outlook. I wouldn't say world, but outlook in the next few years, hopefully. And I just wanted to know that over the past 4 years with the current administration, the current president, the number of refugees that we have accepted in this country annually, it's around 30,000, I think, reduced to 25,000 this year, I think. And if we look at this number, 30,000, as compared to what the European Union, the number of refugees that they accepted in 2015 and 2016 at the height of the refugee crisis there, they accepted about 1.3 million refugees, just 1 million in Germany. And we have been accepting only about 30,000 per year. So it's amazing. The need is there. So I agree with what Alana is saying, is educate yourself on the policies, on the realities of the migrants and the refugees. Try to educate others, and definitely if you can volunteer to help these people who are in extreme need.
Just tagging onto what Maria said, actually in 2020, under the President Trump administration, they did actually announce a new cap of only 15,000 refugees who will be admitted in 2021. So that's actually the current site cap, which is even lower, right, than what we've seen in the past couple of years. So yeah.
Brad or Tim, any kind of closing thoughts for us?
Well, maybe just one thing about that. Just to shift gears a little bit, I would like to really see some of the entities in public education be a bit more nimble about this as well. I know, for example, in the suburbs around Chicago, they're becoming much more diverse, and some of those districts are certainly, lagging behind a little bit. And I would really like to see them maybe partner with higher ed and places like us to address some of those issues, ways of changing the curriculum, as well as, addressing lots of issues of diversity and ways of learning and a whole bunch of those kinds of issues. I think we've been really slow about that, even in a place like the greater Chicago area, which is a place, well known for its immigrant populations. But I think there's a lot of work, and I'm sure, Alana, you know a lot about this. There's just so much work to be done in those places that are so important to people's everyday lives, but that we just don't see necessarily.
And I would just finally say, we have to work in our neighborhoods. I was talking about how Northeastern is just kind of like a cross section of the world, but I live on the Northwest side. In terms of these politics, it's, I'm sure I'll offend somebody, but it's a dicey area. There's a good, number of support for our current president in the neighborhoods in which I live, but there are also neighborhoods. And it's important that we work to create spaces and let people know, that a lot of us don't support the current policies at work in our administration, to know that there's support and there's a safe world. After the Charlottesville incident in summer 2017. My spouse, who's kind of the real activist in the family, just called for a rally in Portage Park where I live. And we didn't know what would happen because of the nature of our neighborhood. But 400 people showed up to suggest we want a different kind of world. And, you know, and part of it's about willing to take a role in your neighborhood. You know, I have a student who works in the Logan Square Neighborhood Association. Well, she's a former student. And, you know, she kind of came and schooled us all in our neighborhood association about how to help people, with DACA, right? And so just kind of being aware of resources and knowing how to communicate with people about what's available, being there, if someone gets in trouble, they know they can call you, right? Creating safe spaces in our neighborhoods. I think we can all take responsibilities to some extent for our neighborhoods in the most local of ways and basic of ways. Finally, fund the public sphere. Like a place like Northeastern, as Brad and Maria were saying, these are incredibly important places in creating these kind of safe spaces for refugees and immigrants and so forth. And if we don't fund that public sphere and create kind of these spaces, we're in trouble.
That's great. Well, thank you all so much for this wonderful conversation. Thanks to everybody who is listening. Thanks to Tim, Brad, Maria, and Alana. Thanks to Northeastern Illinois University, who've been wonderful partners to the library in so many ways. So we so appreciate them. I want to mention a few upcoming programs that you may be interested in. Thursday, November 19th at 4 p.m., our partners at City Bureau are going to do an interactive workshop called The Future of Borders. So we invite you to register for that. That's going to be a wonderful program. This Friday, November 20th at 7 p.m., we're going to have an annual tradition, the One Book, One Chicago Trivia Night. Obviously, we can't gather in person this year, but we're going to have a lot of fun at virtual trivia. So do put that on your calendar. And then on Thursday, December 3rd at 7 p.m., our keynote address for the season, Mohsin Hamid will be here speaking with Donna Sieben of Booklist. So do mark your calendar for that as well. You can find information on all of these programs at onebookonechicago.org. Also, this event is on demand at YouTube as soon as we end. So if you have a friend who wanted to watch it but couldn't make it tonight, tell them to go to our YouTube page, the Chicago Public Library's YouTube account, and they can watch this and many other programs as well. Thank you all so much for being here. Have a wonderful night.